Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Late autumn wind moved across Gray Butte in slow, uneven breaths as the evening light settled over the crooked storefronts and cracked wagon ruts. The town carrying the usual tension that rose whenever someone mentioned Apache people, and today that tension gathered around a burlap sack lying near the livery, where several men stood over it arguing about what should be done while others kept their distance, as if the sack itself carried trouble. And inside it, Noya shifted weakly, trying to draw. Enough air through the coarse fabric scraped against her mouth. Boots thudded on hard earth as more people wandered closer, voices rising in short bursts, calling her a thief or claiming she brought curses, none of them agreeing on a reason, but all of them eager to leave her somewhere out of sight. And the sheriff leaned against a post pretending to watch the clouds while avoiding every glance, as if the problem would walk away on its own if he did not move. Cole Redden rode in from the West Trail with slow, steady movements after finishing a long supply run, his horse coated in dust and his coat creased from hours in the saddle. And the moment he noticed the crowd formed around something on the ground, he nudged his horse slightly, stopping a few paces away, his tired blue eyes fixed on the sack that trembled when Noya shifted again. He swung down from the saddle without a word, his boots landing firmly, and he walked toward the group with a calm expression that made the loudest voices suddenly quieter. Not because he threatened them, but because he carried the steady look of someone who had already seen enough violence in his life and no longer tolerated pointless cruelty. And when a man tried to explain why the woman had been tied up, Cole only glanced at him once before reaching down. He cut the binding at the top of the sack with a small knife he carried for chores, the blade sliding through coarse rope, and as the fabric loosened, Noya's face appeared, her skin streaked with dirt, her long hair tangled, her wrists rubbed raw from struggling, and she blinked in the direction of the fading light with confusion that turned into fear when the voices behind her rose again. Cole lifted her carefully, one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath her legs, ignoring the protests around him. And when a man grabbed his coat sleeve asking what he thought he was doing, Cole's reply came low and steady. "I'm taking her," spoken with the restraint of someone who did not wish for trouble but would not leave room for negotiation. The men demanded payment, muttering about stolen goods, even though none of them could name what had been taken. And Cole reached into his pocket, placing the last of his coins in the nearest hand because it ended the argument the fastest, then shifted Noya's weight gently and carried her toward his horse while the sheriff pretended not to see anything. He set her in the saddle before climbing behind her, keeping one arm firm around her so she would not fall. And as they rode out of town, the cold air pressed against her torn deerskin dress, while she leaned slightly into his chest because her body had no strength left to hold itself steady, her breath shallow but determined as the lights of Gray Butte faded behind them. Worn fences and low hills came into view as Cole guided the horse toward his ranch several miles out, and Noya's eyes fluttered open long enough to watch the sky darken into deep blue before her head settled against his coat, trusting his silence more than the voices she had heard earlier, trusting the steady rise and fall of his breath as they moved together through the quiet land. By the time they reached his small cabin, the night air held a sharp chill, and Cole lifted her again, carrying her inside where the soft glow of lamplight brushed across the wooden floor. The stove still warm from the fire he kept burning most nights, and without hesitation, he set her on the narrow bed near the stove, adjusting a blanket over her shoulders while she watched him with wary eyes that flicked between fear and relief. He did not ask for her story. He did not question her presence. He simply poured water into a tin cup and held it out to her with a steady hand. And as she reached for it with shaking fingers, the fabric on her wrists shifted, revealing raw marks that made him pause a moment before stepping back to give her space. Noya drank slowly, the warmth from the stove easing the tremble in her breath, while Cole stood nearby, sorting through his thoughts with quiet discipline, his expression controlled but not cold, and the sound of wood popping in the fire filled the space between them as the town's noise faded into distance, leaving only the soft rustle of blankets and the steady crackle of heat. She lay back with careful movements, eyes drifting towards sleep, and Cole remained near the stove, tending the fire with slow strokes of the poker, ensuring the room stayed warm through the night, his silence offering something she had not felt in a long time. Safety without demand, company without fear, as autumn winds swept across the roof and the first night of their new, uncertain bond settled quietly around them. Light crept through the small cabin window in a thin, pale line across the wooden floor, reaching the edge of the blanket where Noya lay, her breathing steady but shallow as she shifted slightly, waking to the warmth of the stove, still holding the last coals from the night. She sat up slowly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders as she looked around the unfamiliar room, her hands resting close to her body as if ready to move at the slightest change in sound. Cole was already awake, standing near the workbench with his coat draped over a chair while he sorted through a coil of rope and a few tools, his movements quiet and methodical as he checked the condition of each item. He didn't turn right away, giving her a moment to adjust, and when she finally lifted her gaze, he offered a small nod, simple and calm. She kept one hand near her side, steadying herself in case she needed to stand quickly, but Cole only reached for the kettle resting on the stove. He filled a tin cup with warm water and placed it on the table without speaking, then stepped aside so she could reach it on her own without feeling cornered. She watched him carefully before moving, each step deliberate on the creaking floorboards, her bare feet adjusting to the cold wood. When she picked up the cup, he noticed the raw lines on her wrists again, the reddish marks showing through her bronze skin. He didn't react with alarm or pity, only a quiet focus, and he turned away just enough to give her space while still keeping her in sight so she would not feel unguarded. She took a sip, the steam rising against her face, and her breathing steadied. Outside the cabin, morning air carried a faint chill and the dry smell of old grass as the wind shifted along the fence line. Cole stepped toward the door, pulling on his coat with slow movements, the stiffness in his left leg noticeable in the way he balanced his weight. He opened the door and looked back at her. "I checked the yard," he said quietly, the words simple and steady. She hesitated, trying to decide how far she could trust the man who had pulled her out of darkness, but something in his tone held no threat. She nodded once and followed him out, keeping a short distance behind him as she wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Cole crossed the yard with steady pace, scanning the ground near the barn where the night wind had scattered dust into small ridges. He checked the latch, tightened a loose board with his gloved hand, and then looked back, noticing Noya watching every motion as if she needed to understand his routine before she could decide her next step. She bent down near the fence where a few dry sticks lay scattered and began gathering them with careful, quiet gestures. Cole paused, surprised by her instinct to help on her first morning here, but he didn't speak. He only shifted aside, slightly, to give her more room. They worked in silence, the kind that didn't weigh on either of them. Her movements grew steadier as she filled her arms with wood, and he repaired the bent hinge on the barn door with slow, strong motions that showed he had done this alone for years. When she brought the wood inside, she added it near the stove, arranging it neatly before stepping back. Cole returned a moment later, brushing dust from his coat sleeve as he set a small pot onto the stove. He added dried beans and water, letting it heat slowly. The smell drifted into the cabin, warm and simple. Noya stood near the doorway, her shoulders tense, but no longer pulled tight with fear. She watched him stir the pot, then opened her palms slightly, revealing a small piece of broken bead that had clung to her dress. She placed it on the table as if leaving a quiet marker of the life she had survived before arriving here. Cole looked at it for a moment, then at her, meeting her eyes with a calm expression that held no questions, no pressure to explain. He pulled out a clean cloth from a drawer and set it beside the table, motioning gently toward her wrists. "If you want," he said. She hesitated, then moved closer, letting him wrap the cloth around her wounds. His hands were steady, careful, and she watched the way he avoided tightening the cloth too much. When he finished, she drew her hands back slowly, her breathing even. The small cabin grew warm again as the pot simmered. Cole stepped outside to cut more wood, and Noya stayed near the stove, arranging the pieces she had collected earlier. Their movements were separate but aligned, each task fitting into the next without planning. By the time the sun rose higher above the ridge, the room felt lived in. Not fully, not comfortably, but no longer as a place where a stranger had been dropped half-conscious hours before. Noya lifted her head toward the door when Cole stepped back inside, carrying an armful of wood, and he paused briefly, seeing her watching him with a quieter gaze than the night before. He set the wood down, brushed the coal from his gloves, and looked around the small room that now held two people instead of one. He didn't say anything else, yet the morning felt different, steadier, as if the start of something unspoken had taken root in the quiet space between them. The afternoon settled over the ranch with a muted glow, the sky a pale stretch of washed-out blue as Cole stepped outside with an armful of tools, the dust shifting under his boots in slow puffs. He moved with steady purpose toward the broken section of fence near the east pasture, his shoulders rising and lowering with each deliberate breath while Noya watched from the doorway, her blanket folded neatly beside her and her hair falling loose around her shoulders in dark, uneven strands. She hesitated before stepping out, one hand sliding along the doorframe as she tested the air beyond the cabin, unsure if she was free to move or expected to stay inside. Cole noticed her standing there, paused only long enough to glance toward the open yard, and then continued walking with the calm certainty that she would follow only if she chose to. Nothing in his posture pressured her, and nothing in his tone earlier had told her where she must be. After a long moment, she walked toward him, the earth cool beneath her bare feet, the wind brushing against the torn edges of her deerskin dress. Cole slowed near the bent post, set the tools on the ground, and positioned himself to lift the frame into place. She watched his movements carefully, noting the strain in his injured leg as he shifted his weight to brace the fence. Without a word, she stepped beside him and pressed her hands against the wooden rail, steadying it so he could hammer the nails straight. Cole didn't speak, didn't question her presence, only adjusted his grip and began striking the nail with slow, even hits that vibrated through the post into her palms. The two of them held the fence together, each motion syncing with the other, the kind of shared work that usually came from long familiarity rather than single day. When he finished, Cole rested the hammer against the post, rolling his shoulder once to ease the stiffness. Noya stepped back, wiping a thin line of dust from her wrist where the cloth binding rested, and her eyes moved across the open field where dry grass swayed in the wind. She stood there quietly, breathing in the wide silence of the land. Cole retrieved another rail and carried it with both hands, and she followed him again without needing to be asked. They repaired 3 more sections before the sun dipped behind the ridge, each task completed in quiet coordination, his strength lifting the heavier boards, her quick hands holding nails steady, his patient pace matching her cautious steps. When everything sat firm and straight, Cole brushed his palms against his coat and looked toward the barn. "I feed the horse," he said calmly. Noya tilted her head slightly, reading his tone, then walked beside him to the barn where the warm smell of hay drifted through the open door. The horse lifted its head, ears twitching, and Noya slowed her step with instinctive caution. Cole took a small scoop of grain and held it out for her to offer. She hesitated only a breath before extending her hand, the horse nudging gently into her palm. Cole watched her closely, not to judge, but to make sure she felt safe, and when she stepped back, brushing stray hay from her hair, he placed his hand briefly on the stall door, steadying it as if giving her time to gather her thoughts. They left the barn together, the daylight fading into cooler shades. Noya wrapped her arms around her torso against the wind, while Cole locked the barn door with a simple latch. As they walked back toward the cabin, she stayed closer than earlier, her steps lighter, her gaze shifting toward him with less guarded tension. Inside the cabin, the stove's warmth met them with steady heat. Cole set the kettle on top, adding water for the evening meal, and Noya moved toward the small table where she began arranging 2 tin bowls. She did it without waiting for instruction, without checking if he approved, her hands moving with quiet certainty as though she was reclaiming a small part of her own routine. Cole noticed but said nothing, giving her the space to shape her own place in the room. He mixed dried beans and pieces of jerky into the pot, stirring slowly while she sat across from him, resting her hands on the table with fingers curled against the wood. When he set the bowls down a short time later, Noya lifted her head, watching the steam rise. They ate in silence, broken only by the soft scrape of spoons and the low crackle of the stove. She studied his face between small bites, the worn lines around his eyes, the faint twitch in his jaw when his injured leg bothered him, the steadiness that never shifted even when fatigue showed in the slope of his shoulders. Halfway through the meal, she set her spoon down and touched the cloth around her wrists, tightening it herself as if to reclaim ownership of the wound instead of hiding it. Cole noticed and paused, his spoon hovering above his bowl, but he didn't interrupt. He let her tend to herself. As night settled deeper outside, he rose to add wood to the stove. The flames brightened, casting warm light across the cabin, and Noya moved her blankets slightly closer to the fire without asking if it was allowed. Cole adjusted the kettle lid, then returned his chair with slow steps, the cabin settling in a quiet that felt different than the night before, less like two strangers surviving the same room, and more like two people sharing the same ground, the same air, the same steady rhythm. When she finally lay down on the narrow bed, she didn't turn her face toward the wall. She watched him for a moment longer, her expression steady, then closed her eyes with the faint understanding that this place, at least tonight, held no danger for her. Cole sat at the table, listening to the soft whisper of her breathing mixing with the stove's low hum, and he let his tired gaze rest on the fire, the quiet of the room settling into him with unexpected ease as another night began in the small cabin they now occupied together. Gray light flickered across the cabin walls as dawn pushed its way over the hills, the cold slipping through the seams of the old wood. Cole woke before the sun cleared the ridge, the habit carved into him from years of ranch work and long nights spent alone. He rose without sound, pulling on his boots and coat, the floorboards creaking once under his weight. Noya was already awake. She sat near the stove with her knees drawn close, her long hair hanging loose as she fed a small piece of wood into the fire. The flames caught slowly, glowing along the edges of the bark before settling into a steady burn. She glanced up when Cole moved, her dark eyes alert but calmer than the day before. He nodded once, a quiet greeting, and reached for the chipped kettle. She reached at the same moment. Their hands stopped a few inches apart. Neither pulled back immediately. Noya lowered her gaze first, stepping aside, and Cole took the kettle without comment. The moment passed without tension, but something small shifted in the air, an early recognition that their routines had begun to overlap naturally. He placed the kettle on the stove and stepped outside to check the weather. Cold wind carried the smell of dry grass, and clouds held low to the horizon. A storm might drift through later, or maybe it would pass. Out here, nothing stayed predictable. He scanned the yard. The fences held. The barn was quiet. Nothing seemed disturbed. Noya stepped out behind him, wrapped in a blanket over her deerskin dress. She surveyed the land with the same careful eye he used, noting the paths through the grass, the wind-blown dirt along the fence rails, the animal tracks near the trough. She moved closer to the barn, pausing each time the wood creaked, but she kept moving. Cole watched her assess the surroundings. She wasn't looking for escape. She was checking for danger. He recognized the habit instantly. He returned inside to prepare a simple breakfast, bread warmed on the stove and pieces of dried meat softened in the kettle's steam. Noya entered a few moments later, her hair tousled by the wind. She accepted the piece of bread he handed her, their fingers not touching, her eyes flicking to his briefly before settling on the table. They ate with quiet focus, each bite measured. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It had weight, but no sharp edges. Cole finished first and set his bowl aside, then reached for his gloves. "I checked the herd today," he said. Noya tilted her head, listening carefully to each word. She stood without hesitation and followed him outside. He didn't question why. She didn't offer a reason. They walked to the pasture, the land stretching wide under the pale sky. The few cattle Cole kept grazed near a patch of scrub, their tails swaying lazily. He counted them, moving slow, and she stood close enough to watch but far enough not to startle them. When one young steer shifted too quickly, She stepped back, her shoulders tensing. Cole noticed the reaction, but said nothing. She steadied herself quickly, breathing through the sudden rush of memory, then moved closer again. He checked the trough and discovered it nearly empty. The pump was sticking again. Cole knelt to inspect it, testing the handle with careful pressure. It resisted, grating against the frozen metal, and he let out a slow breath. Noya stepped beside him and wrapped both hands around the handle. She waited for him to join her. He placed his palm over hers, only for the leverage, and together they pushed. The metal groaned once, then gave way. Water sputtered out, cold and clean. She stepped back, rubbing her chilled hands together while Cole filled the trough. For a moment he caught her watching him, her expression steady, as if she were weighing how much of herself she could place in this quiet partnership. When they returned to the cabin, the wind had grown sharper. Cole paused at the doorframe, noticing fresh tracks in the dirt. 3 horses, heavy riders, heading toward Gray Butte. He crouched to study them. They were not from his land. Noya stopped behind him. Her breathing changed. Cole stood slowly, brushing dust from his glove. Men passed through, he said. Her eyes narrowed toward the trail. She recognized the shape of danger even before the explanation. Inside, the fire crackled softly. Cole added another log while Noya crossed her bed and adjusted the blanket. As she settled, she kept her gaze fixed on the door, listening for distant hoofbeats or any shift in the wind. Cole noticed. He sat at the table instead of returning to chores. He stayed inside. A quiet line had been drawn, the kind no one needed to speak aloud. She remained where she felt safest. He remained where she trusted him to be. As the fire warmed the room, her shoulders lowered a fraction, and Cole rested his elbow on the table, watching her breathe easier in the steady heat. Neither spoke, but the cabin felt different now, less like a shelter for a stranger and more like a place where 2 guarded lives had begun to settle beside each other. Outside, the land stayed quiet. Inside, so did they. But the silence felt shared, not separate. The wind rose before noon, sweeping loose dust across the yard in thin, wandering sheets. Cole stepped out of the barn with a bucket of feed in one hand, squinting toward the trail that led in from Gray Butte. Something in the air felt unsettled, too still between gusts, too quiet even for his remote stretch of land. Noya stood near the cabin door, her hands resting lightly against the frame as she watched him work. She hadn't spoken once that morning, but she stayed close enough that he could hear the soft shift of her feet on the wooden step. Cole poured the feed into the trough and set the bucket aside. He wiped his gloves against his coat, paused, and listened. Noya's posture changed the moment he straightened. Her head tilted toward the same direction he had turned. Hoofbeats. Slow. Heavy. Coming from the ridge. Cole took a few steps toward her. He didn't rush, didn't change expression, didn't reach for the rifle beside the door. He simply stood there with the calm readiness of a man who had lived through enough conflict to feel danger long before it appeared. The horses came into view, 3 men riding in a straight, purposeful line. They weren't rushing, but they weren't wandering either. The lead rider, a tall man with a short coat and a scarf lined with dust, raised a hand in greeting as they approached the yard. Noya tensed, her fingers tightening around the wood until her knuckles paled. Cole shifted just enough to stand between her and the riders. Not dramatically, not with aggression, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided the outcome of this meeting. The men slowed their horses near the fence. The leader spoke first. Redden. Cole didn't step forward. Morning. We heard you took in a woman yesterday. The man continued, pulling off his gloves. Town's asking questions. Folks claim she stole from the supply shed. Cole kept his arms relaxed at his sides. She stays here. The man blinked, caught off guard by how simple the statement was. You're saying you're keeping her? Cole's voice didn't change. I'm saying she stays. The men exchanged looks, shifting in their saddles. They weren't ready for a fight. That much was clear, but they expected debate, argument, some version of the usual resistance people offered before backing down. Cole gave him none of that. He took one step closer, boots pressing into the dirt with slow, grounded weight. He didn't reach for a weapon, didn't raise his tone, didn't flinch. He simply stood there, angled just enough to block Noya from view. Behind him, she stayed silent, but her breathing steadied as she watched the line of his shoulders. The leader scratched his jaw. Town don't want trouble. Then they shouldn't come looking for any, Cole said. The air tightened for a moment as the men looked at him, recognizing the boundary he had drawn. It wasn't a threat. He'd made none. It was a statement of fact delivered by someone who would not be moved once he'd settled his stance. Finally, the leader exhaled. Well, she's your problem now. Cole didn't answer. He didn't need to. The men turned their horses and rode back the way they came, their silhouettes shrinking along the ridge until the dust swallowed them. The hoofbeats faded to nothing. Cole waited until the last sound drifted away before turning. Noya stood still, her shoulders rigid, her hands gripping the doorframe. When she met his eyes, her breath hitched softly, a small sound she tried to hold back. He stepped inside first, giving her space to follow. She closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment as if grounding herself in the solid wood. Cole returned to the table, removing his gloves. The fire in the stove crackled, filling the room with a steady pulse of warmth. Noya moved slowly toward the window and looked out, checking the trail again. Only when she saw the men were truly gone did her shoulders lower. Cole watched her a moment. They won't be back. She didn't answer, but she walked toward the stove with small, controlled steps. She added a piece of wood to the fire, setting it gently, her fingers trembling just once before she steadied them. Cole sat down, resting both hands on the table. "You're safe here," he said quietly. Noya looked at him, her expression unreadable at first. Then her hand lifted slightly, touching the cloth around her wrist, not as a reminder of fear, but as recognition that someone had drawn a line for her today, not against her. She nodded once. It was a small gesture, but clear and new. Cole adjusted the kettle on the stove, and Noya took her place near the small bed, closer to the fire than before. The silence between them settled again, not heavy now, but steady and shared. Outside, the wind eased. Inside, the house held its warmth. And for the first time since she arrived, Noya sat without watching the door. The days after the men from town passed quietly, the ranch settling into a rhythm neither Cole nor Noya spoke about, yet both moved within as if it had always existed. The early sun cast long beams across the yard each morning, pale and cool, brushing over the fences they had repaired together and the ground they walked each day without thinking to keep count of their steps. Cole carried a bucket toward the barn with his usual steady pace, his limp showing only when the cold bit into his injured leg. Noya followed a few steps behind, her hair braided this time, the small beads woven through it catching small bits of light. She no longer lingered in the doorway waiting for permission. She came outside as naturally as stepping in a breath. Inside the barn, the quiet greeted them like something familiar. The horse nudged the stall door, recognizing the routine. Noya reached for the brush hanging on the wall, hesitating only long enough to glance at Cole. He nodded once, simple, unspoken approval, and she began brushing the horse's neck in long, steady strokes. The animal leaned into her touch, breathing softly. Cole repaired a loose hinge on a feed bin, the metal scraping gently as he tightened it. He watched her from the corner of his eye, not to supervise, but to understand the pace she moved in, the way her shoulders no longer sat as tight as before, the way she adjusted her stance each time the horse shifted. She handled herself with quiet skill. When they finished, they stepped outside together, the cold air carrying the first hints of late autumn frost. Noya wrapped her blanket closer around her shoulders and looked toward the cabin, then toward the pasture, as if deciding where to go next. Cole pointed to the woodpile. "Need more cut," he said. She nodded once and followed him. The axe rested against the chopping block, the blade gleaming faintly. Cole set a log in place, raised the axe, and brought it down with a clean, powerful strike. Wood split. Noya stepped forward, collecting the pieces and stacking them by the cabin wall. She worked efficiently, her movements stable now, no longer wary of everything that creaked or shifted around her. It stayed like that a while, his axe rising and falling, her hands gathering and placing each piece of wood with careful precision, their breaths forming small clouds in the cooling air. When the pile had grown high enough, Cole lowered the axe and rested it against the block. Noya brushed sawdust from her arms and looked toward the ridge in the distance. The sky had begun to change, thickening clouds drifting slowly, hinting at early snow. Cole followed her gaze. "Storm maybe," he said. She nodded. Her fingers touched the sleeve of her dress, tracing a frayed line where it had torn the night she was captured. Without speaking, she lifted the edge slightly, as if showing him the damage. He understood. He went inside and returned with a small sewing kit, bone needles, coarse thread, a few scraps of fabric. He set them on the porch beside her. No words needed. She sat down immediately. Noya threaded the needle with the same concentration she used to study the land. Her hands were steady, precise. Cole sat nearby on the step, adjusting the latch on a lantern with a small screwdriver. The two worked in silence, but their tasks felt connected somehow, like part of the same effort to shape a home that could hold both of them. As she sewed, the blanket fell from her shoulders and the marks on her wrists became visible again. The deeper bruises had faded, the raw lines had softened. Cole didn't stare. He simply glanced long enough to ensure they were healing, then returned to his work. After a long, quiet stretch, Noya lifted the dress toward the light to inspect the stitch line. She nodded once, satisfied, then placed the needle back in the small wooden box. Cole stood and shook the tension from his hands after finishing the lantern. When they entered the cabin, the fire had dimmed. Noya bent to rebuild it, arranging new logs, blowing softly on the embers until orange glow spread beneath them. Cole watched from across the room, noting how naturally she handled the space now, how she moved without flinching each time the stove popped, how she reached for the kettle without looking to him first. Something had shifted, something quiet but solid. Late in the afternoon, Cole sat at the table poring over a torn map he used for checking landmarkers. Noya approached slowly and stood beside him, her eyes scanning the lines and edges. She traced one trail lightly with her finger, one leading far east. Cole folded the map closer, not hiding it but bringing their focus inward. "No reason to go there," he said softly. Noya met his gaze. Her eyes held no fear now, only thought. After a moment, she shook her head. No, she wasn't leaving. Her choice was small, simple, wordless, yet unmistakable. Cole leaned back in his chair, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The room felt warmer than the fire alone could account for. As evening settled outside, he prepared a pot of stew while she arranged the bowls. They ate without rush, without tension, the quiet between them no longer filled with caution, but something steadier, something like belonging beginning to form shape by shape, routine by routine. By the time the first flakes of snow drifted against the window, Noya had settled near the stove, her repaired dress folded neatly beside her bed. Cole checked the door latch, then sat down across from her, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and the faint rustle of fabric as she braided her hair again. There were no words, but neither of them needed any. The cabin felt like theirs now, not because of a promise, not because of a claim, but because neither of them had stepped back from the quiet life forming between them. Snow began falling before dusk, quiet and steady, drifting across the ridge in loose white strands that softened every sound. By the time Cole finished securing the barn doors against the wind, the ground carried a thin coat of white, and his breath rose in short clouds. He stepped back toward the cabin with slow, measured steps, brushing snow from his coat sleeve as he approached the warm glow pushing through the window. Inside, Noya knelt near the stove, feeding the fire with careful motions. The warmth had filled the cabin in a steady wave, pushing the cold back from the walls. Her hair had been braided again, the leather ties resting against her back, and she moved with a quiet steadiness that hadn't been there on her first night. Cole set his gloves on the table, shaking the snow free. Noya lifted her head when he entered. She looked toward the window, then at him. He understood her concern without needing words. "Storm small," he said. She nodded once, trusting his judgment. He took off his coat and hung it on a wooden peg, the familiar scent of cold air lingering in the room. Noya stood from a stove and walked to the small table where their bowls rested. She set them down with a faint clink of metal, then glanced toward the pot simmering quietly. Cole watched her movements, the cautious care she took in arranging everything, the steady breaths she made sure not to rush. She no longer kept her back to the walls. She no longer watched every shadow. She moved in the cabin as though she belonged to it, even if she hadn't said so aloud. He ladled stew into the bowls, and they ate together in the calm silence that had become part of their evenings. The sound of the wind brushed faintly against the roof, softened by the layer of snow growing thicker by the hour. When she finished her meal, Noya rose and wrapped her blanket around her shoulders. She stood near the window for a long moment, watching the slow fall outside. Cole set the bowls aside, his eyes drifting toward her as he leaned back in his chair. She touched the edge of the window frame lightly, not checking for danger, just watching. That simple shift felt like something settling into place. Cole rose and moved toward the fire. He added a large piece of wood, the heat rising up his arm as the flames brightened. Noya stepped closer, not too close, but near enough that the warmth caught her face. Her eyes met his briefly. It wasn't fear this time. It wasn't uncertainty. It was something quieter, steadier. She sat on her bed, pulling her repaired dress into her lap, smoothing the fabric with slow strokes. Cole returned to the table, but didn't sit. He stood by the chair, leaning one hand against its back. The cabin lights cast long, warm shadows across the floor. Minutes passed without either speaking. Finally, Noya lifted her head, her breath steady. She touched the cloth around her wrist, the same cloth he had wrapped days ago, and untied it slowly. The skin beneath was healing. The sharp redness faded into thin, pale lines. Cole watched, his expression unreadable but softened by the way she moved with quiet confidence. She placed the cloth gently beside her, then let her hands rest on her lap. The fire popped softly. Snow tapped against the window. Cole cleared his throat once, a small sound that broke the stillness just enough. "If the storm grows," he said, "we stay in tomorrow. No need to work outside." She nodded, accepting the plan without hesitation. Not because he told her, because she trusted his judgment now. She stood and approached the stove, holding her hands near the rising heat. Cole shifted slightly to give her space, though she stood close enough that they shared the same circle of warmth. The quiet between them settled in again, not as emptiness but as recognition, two people who had shaped a space together without pressing for anything more. After a while, Noya sat down on her bed. Cole extinguished the lantern closest to the door, but left the one near the stove burning low. The faint flicker washed across her face, softening the angles of her expression. Before lying down, she reached out and gently adjusted the blanket folded at the foot of the bed, an unconscious gesture he recognized as comfort rather than fear. Cole stepped back toward his chair, then paused. Noya watched him for a moment, her eyes lingering with a new steadiness, something quiet and sure. She placed a small piece of wood into the fire before settling under the blanket. He took his seat, angled toward the stove, listening to the storm outside. He didn't check the windows again. He didn't reach for his rifle. He simply stayed where he was, aware of her warm presence across the room. Noya closed her eyes, her breathing even out, soft and calm, not the shallow breaths of a woman waiting for danger, but the steady rhythm of someone who felt safe enough to rest. Cole leaned back in his chair and let the last tension in his shoulders ease, the snow falling heavier outside while the fire burned quietly between them. The storm continued through the night. Neither of them feared it. They faced it in the same warm space, together without speaking a word. By morning, the storm had thinned, leaving a thick blanket of snow over the ranch that brightened the land with a cold, unbroken light. Cole stepped outside first, pushing the door open with slow pressure so the drift wouldn't collapse inward. The air bit at his skin, sharp enough to sting, and his boots sank into the fresh layer with a muted crunch. Noya followed a moment later, wrapping her blanket firmly around her shoulders. Her breath rose in soft clouds. She looked across the yard with steady, careful eyes, no longer searching for danger, but taking in the changed world laid out before them. Smooth snow, silent fences, untouched ground. Cole tested the barn door, ensuring the latch held. The snow had weighed down the roof a little, but nothing dangerous. He checked the hinges, then worked the lock with practiced fingers. Noya watched him work, her steps slow in the snow, her bare footprints tracing a straight line behind her. Inside the barn, the horse shifted with a low grunt. Cole brushed snow from his coat sleeve and began clearing the stall, his movements calm and efficient. Noya stepped toward the hayrack, gathering handfuls of dry grass. She kept the blanket on, tucking it under one arm as she worked. Cole noticed her shiver once when the wind pushed through the boards. "Cold," he said quietly. Noya turned her head slightly. She nodded but continued working, her hands not slowing. When she finished feeding the horse, she held her palms over its warm breath for a moment before stepping back outside. Cole lingered a little longer, adjusting the saddle straps and brushing the horse's back. When he exited the barn, Noya was standing near the trough, brushing snow off the wooden edge with long strokes of her fingers. Her face carried a thoughtful stillness he'd begun to recognize. He walked toward her, leaving a trail of deep footprints. "Water's frozen," he said. She already knew. The thin top layer of ice reflected the pale morning sky. She stepped aside as he chipped it loose with a small iron bar. The cracked pieces fell inward, breaking into smaller shapes that drifted and dissolved. Noya crouched, scooping one piece between her fingers. She let it melt slowly in her hand. Cole watched her. The cold didn't frighten her. The open space didn't unsettle her. Something else was on her mind. She stood and looked toward the trail leading back to Gray Butte. He stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. "You're thinking," he said. She lifted her chin toward the ridge where the trail ran. Not in fear, just acknowledgement. Something had shifted in her last night, something clearer and stronger. Cole followed her gaze. He understood the question she wasn't asking. "No riders," he said. "Not since the three." Noya lowered her gaze and wrapped her blanket tighter, the wind pushing her braid back. She wasn't worried about the men returning. She was testing her place here, measuring whether safety was something she had found or something she only hoped for. He didn't ask what she was deciding. He let her stand there in the silence, the wind moving around them like a steady breath across the open land. After a long moment, she stepped toward him, not close, just a half step forward, enough to show she had made her choice. She pointed lightly toward the cabin door. Work, warmth, routine. She was choosing the day with him. They went inside, the heat from the stove settling into their bones. Cole brushed snow from his boots, then set water to heat while Noya arranged the blankets in neater folds beside her bed. The quiet between them felt different today, more certain, less cautious. She sat near the fire, warming her hands. Cole prepared a small meal, moving around her in the narrow space with an ease that had grown between them naturally. When he set the bowl in front of her, she lifted her eyes and held his gaze longer than she had before. Not gratitude, not fear, something steadier, a recognition. She ate slowly, listening to the stove's low hum. Cole took his place at the table, watching her from the corner of his eye. The cabin no longer felt as though it held two strangers. The air moved differently inside it now, warming corners that had stayed cold for years. After the meal, she reached for her repaired dress. Not to fix it again, but to wear it. She changed quietly, then stood before him. He glanced up, noticing how carefully she had arranged the seams, how much straighter she held her shoulders. He understood the message. She was no longer the woman pulled from a sack in the dust. She was someone standing on her own feet. Cole stepped aside as she opened the door and looked outside, not as if expecting danger, not as if deciding whether to run. She looked at the land as though it might finally belong to her too. He came to stand beside her, close but not touching. The cold swept into the cabin in a slow, steady wave. Noya stepped out first. Cole followed. The snow crunched beneath them in the same rhythm. They crossed the yard without speaking, their steps aligned, their breath rising in shared clouds, their movements quiet but certain. The snowstorm had remade the land, and something in them had shifted with it. Not a confession, not a promise, but the beginning of one. By late afternoon, the snow had settled into thin, glittering layers across the yard, soft enough to muffle footsteps and bright enough to reflect every bit of fading light. Cole stood near the barn, stacking the last of the firewood he had carried in from the shed, the breath rising steadily from him in pale trails. His leg ached more in the cold, but he worked without slowing, the kind of persistence that came less from strength than from habit built over long, quiet years. Noya walked toward him, her repaired deerskin dress brushing against the snow as she moved. The wind lifted her braid behind her, the small beads catching bits of the dimming sky. She stopped near the fence, close enough for him to see the steadiness in her stance. She held a small folded bundle in her hands, her blanket tightly wrapped. Cole set down the last piece of wood and wiped the frost from his gloves. He looked at her, not questioning why she stood there, not pushing for an explanation. The silence between them had grown into something he understood and respected. Noya approached with deliberate steps. She held the folded blanket out slightly, not offering it away, but showing it to him. The edges were worn from use, the corners softened by nights spent clinging to warmth. She pressed her thumb lightly against the stitching she had repaired herself. She was telling him something without speaking. She no longer needed the blanket as protection. From an unfamiliar place, she wasn't preparing to flee. She was choosing to stay. Cole took in her expression, the quiet certainty in her eyes. She lowered the blanket and stepped closer, her feet sinking into the snow with slow, steady pressure. She pointed gently toward the cabin. Home. Her meaning was clear. Cole nodded once, a small movement, but full of weight. Then we stay, he said, his voice low and even. Noya breathed out softly, not as relief, but as acceptance. She reached down to lift one end of the woodpile, helping him carry it toward the porch. He didn't stop her. Their steps matched as they climbed the short set of stairs, snow slipping from their boots. Inside, warmth wrapped around them immediately. The fire crackled, filling the cabin with a calm glow. Cole set the wood beside the stove, while Noya hung her blanket neatly over the chair. Her movements were unhurried, confident, familiar. She turned toward him and waited. Cole paused beside the table, resting one hand against the edge. He studied her quietly, the steadiness in her shoulders, the faint lift of her chin, the way she no longer kept her weight ready to flee. She had been ready to walk away from everything days ago, but now she stood before him with her feet rooted to the floor of his cabin. He walked toward her, slow and unforced, stopping only when he stood close enough for both of them to share the same warm circle of firelight. She looked up unguarded. He raised his hand, not touching her, only offering the space for her to decide. Noya lifted her hand and placed it lightly against his chest, her palm resting over the steady beat beneath his coat. Her fingers didn't tremble. Her breath didn't hitch. She held her hand there, as though marking a place she meant to stay. Cole covered her hand with his touch gentle, firm enough to show he understood. No promise spoken, no vow declared, just the quiet, final agreement between two people who had found something worth keeping. As evening deepened, they prepared supper together. Noya added water to the pot, while Cole stirred the last of the dried vegetables into the simmering broth. Their movements overlapped naturally, no hesitation, no uncertainty about where each belonged. After they ate, Cole stepped outside to check the sky one last time. The storm had passed completely, leaving a vast, calm stretch of stars across the cold horizon. When he re-entered the cabin, Noya had placed 2 chairs beside the stove instead of one. She looked at him once, a brief glance, and he understood. They sat down together. Heat from the stove eased the chill from their boots. Outside, the snow lay undisturbed. Inside, the soft glow of firelight reflected along Noya's cheek as she leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed in a way he had never seen before. She belonged here. He no longer lived alone. The trauma that had brought them together no longer defined the room they shared. Before the fire dimmed, Noya rose, walked to her bed, and placed her hand on Cole's arm as she passed. A quiet gesture, but full of intent. He returned the touch with calm assurance. She lay down, her breathing steady. Cole extinguished the lantern but left the stove burning low. He took his seat beside her bed for a moment, watching the snowlight shift across the walls. When Noya opened her eyes halfway, she looked at him not with fear, not with guarded caution, but with quiet belonging. He stood, brushed the edge of her blanket once to straighten it, and said the only words needed. "You're home now." She nodded, her eyes closing again, comfort settling over her like the final layer of warmth the fire offered. Cole moved to his own bed on the other side of the cabin, but for the first time in years, the room didn't feel empty. It didn't feel temporary. It felt lived in. It felt shared. Outside, the cold night deepened, but the cabin held steady warmth. Two lives, once broken, once wandering, had settled in the same quiet space. No questions left, no fear pressing in, just a home built through silence, work, small gestures, shared days, and the simple decision to stay. The story ended with both of them safe, together, and belonging to a life they chose freely.